Hi, my name is Corey Driver, and this is Moving Forward. So this week we are in Exodus 20, 1 Corinthians 1, and John 2, and we are talking about a Messiah who is almost laughable. Now, a couple weeks ago, I was hanging out with a beloved colleague, and we were giving each other life updates. I was talking about my kids, he was talking about his, and he said, and Lucy's doing great too. And I couldn't remember who Lucy was. And he, I think, saw it in my eye, and he said, do you know who Lucy is? And I, falsely overconfident and maybe a little bit flustered, thinking I'd forgotten the name of one of his daughters, said, oh yeah, I know Lucy, of course. And he said, who's Lucy then? Calling me on my bluff. And it was ridiculous. And so I had to be honest and said, I don't know. And he said, Lucy is my daughter's pet python, and she's fine too. So good news, the python is well. And I don't know what happened. It was just like silly, and I don't know why I doubled down knowing who Lucy was. It was just kind of ridiculous. And in the gospel readings, in the lectionary readings for this week, we have other things that are just kind of ridiculous. So in the gospel reading for this week, Jesus enters Jerusalem during Passover, which he did frequently. And during this Passover, he said something kind of silly, something kind of ridiculous, something almost laughable. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days later, I will rebuild it. Now, this is silly for a couple reasons. The first of which is it took Herod the Idumean and his descendants about 46 years to build it. With ample funding, Herod was counseled by his sister to gather all the building materials in advance so that the building project would go very quickly and it wouldn't be disrupted or delayed. So this was a very smooth, relatively fast building process, as the temple was entirely reclad. It was actually raised a little bit. The supports, the surrounding courts were enlarged. This is a massive, massive building project that you can see the stones of even to this day. And so it went quickly at 46 years. And Jesus will say, I will rebuild it in 3 days. Now, Herod also built the Antonia fortress, named after Herod's early patron, Mark Antony, which overshadowed the temple and housed the garrison of soldiers that would cause, mass death at least a few times in and around the temple. And please make no mistake, to destroy the temple and rebuild it is not just silly, but it's also a threat. The temple is the central icon of Herod's power and devotion to Jerusalem. The fortress next to it is a central icon right in the middle of Jerusalem of Roman power through their puppet Herod, and then finally during direct rule. The threat to destroy the temple, much less rebuild it in 3 days, is Jesus offering a threat to the Romans, to the powers, to say, I can destroy this thing. Now, make no mistake, the writers of the gospel want us to know, and so there is an insertion that Jesus was talking about the temple of his body. And yet, his hearers, at least the first hearers, did not know that and thought that he was talking about the temple and thought he was talking about challenging Roman authority. Look, the Romans and the Herodians collaborated to build this thing, destroy it, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. That is a threat that eventually the Romans carry out, destroying both the temple that they had indirectly funded and Jesus's body itself, allowing himself to be killed by the Romans is almost laughable, just foolishness. And Paul enters into this conversation to say, yes, it is exactly foolishness to speak of a dying Messiah. And Paul, ever the contextual theologian, says, yes, this is foolishness and it's doubly offensive, but to two different people. Greeks want wisdom. Jews want displays of power or miracles. Jesus allowing himself to be murdered by the Romans at the behest of some religious leaders isn't apparently wisdom or power. Instead, it's foolishness. It's almost laughable. It's ridiculous to think that the Messiah would not argue his way out. Jesus, in front of his accusers, is silent. He could have displayed the wisdom of the cosmos. Instead, he offered no rebuttal. He could have called down legions of angels to save him, as was suggested from the cross, and yet he did not do that either. Instead, he merely died. This is a stumbling block for those looking for wisdom or power, to be sure. It's almost laughable. Even way, way back in Exodus 20, God's stipulations are ridiculous, almost laughable. Unlike surrounding peoples, the people of God were not to worship idols, were not to even make them in the first place. They were to follow only one God, just one God, irrespective of what land they were in. The different gods have different territories, to be sure. And they were supposed to follow a mobile god in Egypt, in the Promised Land, in Syria, in Babylon. How can we worship our God in a strange land? But nevertheless, they were to worship one God. And the real kicker, a real kind of little bit of insanity, is that God stopped work on the seventh day. And so, therefore, the Israelites and those who chose to sojourn with them, and remember, the Exodus is not a monoethnic event, those who followed God were to emulate God in not working on the Sabbath. Actually, don't do work. And we can talk about, and we should talk about, what work means and what it doesn't mean. But here it is work that might be closely aligned with tabernacle building, right? And so at any rate, you as a human emulate God who does not work on the seventh day, and to be sure gets right back to work on the eighth day, and so do humans. But what does it mean to not work? And isn't that a little inconvenient after all? And centuries later, by Jesus's time, what it means to work and not work is still being worked out. And even today, there are some discussions about what is and isn't work and allowed on the Sabbath, and what does it mean to fully live into that, and what are the exceptions to the rules, because there always are. But this is the notion in Exodus 20 that the reasoning is for Sabbath, that God rested, so humans should rest. That just seems almost laughable. So as we continue this Lenten journey, we should allow ourselves to analyze what a strange and bizarre and ridiculous and almost laughable path we have been called to. In a world that values strength and permanence, Jesus allows himself to be killed. In a world that values wisdom and miraculous power, Jesus allowed himself to be killed. In a world that lionizes productivity and performance, God says, rest. And not just you humans do it, but I'm going to do it as well. That's almost laughable. The life of discipleship is almost laughable, but guess what? God's wisdom is wiser than that of humans. And thanks be to God for that. Amen.